A stakeholder is someone who has a vested interest in how something turns out. The presidential selection process involves a lot of different stakeholders. The national political parties want to make sure that the candidates chosen to represent them are both appealing enough to get elected, as well as fully committed to the party's beliefs. States want to make sure that their citizens' voices are heard in the process. They also want to ensure that their state as a whole is influential and receives the economic and prestige benefits that go along with that influence. The state political parties find themselves caught in the middle. On the one hand, they owe an allegiance to their national party. On the other hand, their needs and concerns are tied to their particular state, needs and concerns that the national party might have little interest in focusing on. Of course, we also can't forget two other important sets of stakeholders: the American public themselves, who are interested in choosing the best candidates possible for the race, and the candidates themselves, who have an interest in winning. As you may recall, the presidential selection process has four separate parts. Only the last two stages, the general election and electoral college, are officially part of the process as designed by the framers. Everything else is the result of more than 200 years of state law, party practice, and informal deals among the stakeholders. The successive rounds of change within this process demonstrate the dynamics at work. For example, conventions arose to give regular members of a political party more say in the process, removing some of the power from the party's elected officials. In the end, this attempt at improving the system's democrativeness fell short, helping instead to solidify the power of unelected party leaders. Perhaps the best place to see these dynamics at work is in the decision about what type of nominating event will be used in a state. In current practice, there are two basic options: the caucus and the primary. Caucuses appear to have developed in the 1830s, roughly when national party conventions began. Given that the real selection of presidential candidates was now happening at the national convention, the local caucus became a way for members of a political party to choose the delegates that would serve at state and national conventions. Caucuses, in other words, were a way to choose the choosers. Caucuses were the preferred method for delegate selection up to the 1970s. Presidential primaries were invented in the progressive era of the late 1890s, but didn't really catch on until the 1970s. Some states still use caucuses, and some states even have hybrid systems that combine the two. The majority of states, though, now use primaries alone. Ironically, primaries became the dominant method for the very reason that the progressives invented them almost a century earlier. The end of the 1960s made clear that political party leaders, specifically the Democratic Party, were out of touch with what the average members of their party really believed. Quite consciously, then, many states moved toward the use of primaries, which were seen as more democratic and open to influence from the so-called rank and file of the party. The story doesn't stop there, though. Since their rise, states have invented several variations on the idea of the primary. To help make the struggle between stakeholders crystal clear, let's look at four options available for nominating events: the caucus, plain and simple, the closed primary, the open primary, and the so-called blanket primary. For each, I want to look at three questions: who's responsible and in control, whether the method protects the power of political parties, and how open or democratic the method is. Let's start with the caucus. Technically speaking, political parties are private entities, just like any other kind of club or organization. A caucus, then, is a private gathering organized by the political party itself. They bear the entire cost of organizing and running caucuses, but at the same time, they have absolute control over the rules that get used. Something you can see if you start to examine the minor differences between how the two parties run their caucuses, as well as the differences from one state to another. Quite logically, then, political parties generally love caucuses because they are very protective of the power of the party. For example, it's no accident that the delegates that get chosen to go from one level of caucuses up the chain to the next level tend to be long-term party supporters and activists, fully devoted to their party. Overall participation in caucuses is fairly low. Compared to voting in an election, caucuses are time-consuming. They involve time for presentations about candidates and discussion among caucus goers. In general, caucuses take at least an hour to complete, and since they happen at one very particular time, usually 7 p.m., many people choose not to attend because of the commitment. Those who do attend usually do so either because of a very strong personal commitment to their political party or to their chosen candidate. Primaries, no matter what type, are run by the state. Really a partnership between the state government that sets the rules and local governments that actually organize and pay for them. They're a form of election, just like any other opportunity to vote. What's a bit unusual is that they happen to be a government-sponsored election being held for a private group, the political party. Primaries are a mixed blessing for the parties. On the one hand, the government pays for them and organizes them, which takes a substantial organizational burden off of the shoulders of party leaders. That's a plus. But on the other hand, the state government sets the rules for the primary, and the parties can't always influence that decision in their favor. Where the types of primaries differ is in our last two criteria. To vote in a closed primary, citizens must be registered members of the party they want to vote for. The states themselves vary in terms of how they implement this rule, and even exactly what term they use. According to our terms, Michigan really has an open primary, for example, but they call it a closed primary. Closed primaries are still fairly protective of party power, since only individuals with a formal connection to the party participate. Because party leaders have less control over the process, though, they are more open or broadly democratic than caucuses, which is exactly what the progressive reformers had in mind. Many states have opted to hold open primaries. Voters in an open primary do not need to be formal members of a party. When they show up at their polling place, they're asked which party's ballot they'd like. From the point of view of the political parties, this is a less desirable option. In theory, in an open primary, a party's candidate could be chosen by people who have little interest in or commitment to the party, leading to what the party leaders might consider a weak or undesirable candidate. On the flip side, many states choose to adopt open primaries because more of their citizens will be interested and able to participate, making them more democratic. Blanket primaries are like open primaries on steroids. In addition to not being required to register with a specific party, voters in a blanket primary are allowed to actually vote for multiple parties. Every party's candidates are listed on the same ballot, so when primaries for multiple offices are being held simultaneously, a voter can choose one party's nominee for one office and then choose a different party's nominee in a different race. Blanket primaries are clearly the most open or democratic way of choosing candidates, which is exactly why some states have opted for them. The political parties, however, hate them because they do the most to weaken the power of the political parties and their leaders. In fact, blanket primaries are so controversial that the Supreme Court heard a case about them in 2000, holding that they violated the party's freedom of association. While states are still free to hold blanket primaries, the political parties are also free to ignore their results, although their only recourse is to conduct their own caucuses. So, which nominating method gets used in a state? The decision is a complicated one because the stakeholders in the process, particularly the political parties and the state governments, don't always see eye to eye. Political parties would like to control the process as much as possible. Democracy and broad political participation are not their overriding goals. Instead, they focus on preserving their power and ensuring that an acceptable candidate is chosen to represent them. Many states, however, want to see broader participation in the process in a way that is more clearly democratic. At some point, the two sides compromise, not always happily, and in a way that can vary dramatically from state to state.